We are talking Pride and Prejudice today with stick figures.
Open a book and experience the world like you never have before.
Mr. Collins, as you can see here, Mr. Collins, he's got his little bag here. He is coming to stay with the Bennets for a while. He is the cousin of the girls and a nephew to Mr. Bennet. Now, they don't really know a whole lot about this relative until he comes to stay with him. He is one of the most egotistical, most talkative, crazy, lunatic people I have ever read about. He drives me crazy just reading about him and reading all the things that he has to say. He always gives these long speeches and he always talks highly of himself and highly of Lady Catherine. Mr. Collins is incredibly rude because he doesn't listen to what anybody else is saying because it's all about him. He thinks only about himself. He doesn't find himself to be very egotistical, yet he's another very prideful character within the story. Almost all of the characters in the story are prideful and prejudiced, as is just about everybody in the world. Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy is incredibly reserved. He doesn't really talk a whole lot. He feels that when you talk a whole lot, you tend to say a bunch of stupid things. And he is right. You are incredibly right, Mr. Darcy. When people talk a lot, they really say the stupidest things and make a fool out of themselves, just like Mrs. Bennet. Mr. Darcy really does not like Mrs. Bennet at all because she just talks and talks. So Mr. Darcy has a tendency to be very reserved, very quiet. He has a sister, Georgiana, whom he loves very, very much and has the highest regard for. Now, as I told you before, he is worth a lot of money, so to speak, and he is also the nephew to Lady Catherine. So now we're starting to get a connection here. Mr. Collins lives at Rosing in the parsonage of Lady Catherine. And Mr. Darcy is Lady Catherine's nephew, who she favors a great deal. So we start to see a connection of how all these people are going to start coming together, how Mr. Collins, the relative of the Bennets, is somehow familiar, not very familiar, but we're going to find out that he is familiar with Mr. Darcy through Lady Catherine. Now let's talk about the three youngest girls of the Bennet family. We have Lydia, Mary, and Kitty. Lydia is the youngest, so she's a little naive in things. All she really cares about is going to Meryton and seeing her aunt, Mrs. Phillips, and looking at all the delicious officers that come into town. She is a little naive and she's a little outspoken too, but she doesn't know when to speak. She just interrupts and starts talking about things that nobody really cares about in the middle of anything. They could be talking politics and all of a sudden she would start talking about a bird on the fence. She doesn't really do that, but that's kind of giving you an example of how she speaks. She has no idea of etiquette of speaking. She's a lot like her mom in that respect. We don't hear a lot about Mary. Mary isn't really much of a central character. We know that she likes to read. But other than that, we don't really get a feeling of who Mary is in the story. Nor do we get a feeling of Kitty very often. Now, Kitty and Lydia are pretty close because they're the two youngest. So they're a little naive. They're just, little girls. They are in their teens, their late teens. So they're acting like teenage girls who think they know everything and really just kind of play that teenage girl role really well. And they both like to go into town, like I say. They talk about all the officers that they see, and they have befriended Officer Denny, who then brings in Officer Wickham. Now, he's a smooth talker.
He's a smooth operator. Smooth operator. Smooth operator. Smooth operator.
Elizabeth really hit it off. However, Mr. Wickham has a long history with Mr. Darcy. Mr. Wickham has a lot to say about Mr. Darcy to Elizabeth, and Elizabeth forms a judgment based on Mr. Wickham's accusations and allegations against Mr. Darcy, which by all means anybody would believe. Why wouldn't you? He seems to be arrogant and egotistical, and he seems to be kind of conceited, and he likes to be the boss of everyone. So whatever Mr. Wickham is telling Elizabeth seems real. And Mr. Wickham has no reason not to be believed. He's charming and elegant. He's an officer. And he really is very attentive to Elizabeth. And they really hit it off. They really enjoy each other's company. And Elizabeth begins to feel, kind of attached to Mr. Wickham and begins to feel affection for him, especially by how wronged he was by Mr. Darcy. Another character of this story is Caroline Bingley. She is the sister of Mr. Bingley. You want to talk about egotistical and prideful and conceited. She really is manipulative. She is a false friend. She is not somebody that you could call very friendly by any means. And she thinks very high regards of her brother and begins to think that nobody really is worth his affection. She really despises Elizabeth a lot. And actually in this picture, she is showing Elizabeth, I cut her out here, she is actually trying to show Elizabeth how to walk like a lady around the room, because apparently that's what you did when you were bored. You just walked to the room, as Caroline did. So Elizabeth finds her quite ridiculous. She sees right through Caroline and decides that she's really not worth her time. However, Jane and Caroline are very good friends. They become very good friends when Jane and Mr. Bingley start getting close. Caroline decides to befriend her, thinking that eventually the two will become sisters. So these two young girls become very friendly and become very close friends. But later, Jane will find out just how deceptive and manipulative Caroline is. And even though Caroline starts showing her true colors to Jane, Jane still refuses to think badly of her. So that was just an example of somewhat of the characteristics of the characters. I hope I didn't spoil too much of the story for you, but I want to talk a little bit more about Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I feel that we should explore just a little bit of the theme of this book rather than talking more of the story and how everything goes, because this really does represent the book very well. I have never really read a book that truly takes in the title to heart. The whole book is based around this concept of Pride and Prejudice. It's the pride of money and status, homes, beauty, respect, position, power, and authority. Every character in this book has their own sense of pride and their own sense of prejudice. That's what makes this book so fun. Because when you think of Pride and Prejudice, you're thinking of someone like a Mr. Darcy, who is so conceited and egotistical that you begin to think, yeah, he's really prideful and he's prejudiced against anyone who makes less money or doesn't have quite the estate like he does, especially when we talk about the Bennets and their estate. Everything is based on the estate. What kind of home do you live in? That is really going to tell people who you are, what kind of money you have, and what kind of prestige you have, and how much authority and power you deserve or think you deserve. Everyone in the book has their own pride. Their own pride of wanting to be listened to be heard, to talk better of themselves than they really should, or talking less about others in gossip, and then being very nice and friendly to their face. There's a lot of pride in every single character in this book. Even Jane has a bit of pride in her humility even. We can see some of her pride. As far as prejudice, I don't see a lot of prejudices with Jane. She always tries to keep an open mind about everyone and everything going on. She always tries to see the good in every situation and in every person. Now, when we talk about the prejudices of the characters in the book, a lot of times there's assumptions about people. Every time that we meet somebody for the very first time, we have that first impression that we make, and we have a prejudice one way or the other, whether good or bad. We make an impression. We make a judgment almost immediately upon meeting someone without them sometimes even saying a word, as Mr. Darcy sometimes does. So Mr. Darcy comes off as egotistical and just a jerk. And that is the assumption that a lot of people get from him. And then we have Mr. Collins, who really isn't anything special. He doesn't have any money. He doesn't come from a wealthy family. He's a clergyman at a church. He lives under the authority and the rule of thumb of Lady Catherine. And he thinks because he lives under this rule of Lady Catherine that he is somewhat better than anyone else. And he loves to talk about that. He loves to talk about Lady Catherine. He loves to brag about her, and he loves to brag about how he lives there and how she knows everything better than anyone else. And he continues to brag about himself in a sense that really is not realistic. He really has no authority to even talk about himself in that sense because he really is a lowly nobody. And his incessant talking about himself and about Lady Catherine starts to really wear on everyone's nerves. We also have the pride of wanting status, of wanting to be better than other people, which is why Mrs. Bennet is always seeking to marry off her daughters into a better estate, into money. If you've watched Downton Abbey, then you know the story of what happens with men who have only daughters. They cannot hand over their estate or their property or their money or their wealth to their daughters. It gets handed down to the next in line of their heir. And it could be somebody they don't even know, as you remember in Downton Abbey. And Mr. Collins is that person who is going to take over the estate of Mr. Bennet. And so when they meet him, they want to know what kind of person he is. They want to know who's going to be taking over the estate. Or is he going to be one of those people that kicks them out and just leaves them destitute? Or is he going to be one of those people that takes care of them? So Mrs. Bennet, rightfully so, has a lot to be worried about. She has to worry about her daughters and what's going to happen to them in the future, especially since she knows that none of the wealth that her husband has made will ever be passed on to her daughters. That's just part of the time in the period. Now, we can't think of injustices at the time of this book. We cannot put our modern twist, our modern feminist ways into this thinking. We really have to think about the time, and that's just how it was. And whether we would agree with it or not doesn't matter, because that's how it was. And thankfully, things aren't like that anymore. The characters had a lot of pride and prejudice about who they were going to marry and why they were going to marry them. And the reason why they had the prejudices was because they needed somebody to secure their future. But Mrs. Bennet is more concerned about her own reputation. She was always thinking about herself. While in some sense she believes that she's only looking out for the benefit of her daughters, in reality, she's really thinking about herself and her status and her reputation and how every one of her daughters makes her look within the neighborhood, within the town. She is more concerned about how she looks rather than what she really is. So she puts on airs a lot. She goes out to the balls or to the dinners and she starts acting better than everyone. And she starts insisting that certain things are going to happen that may or may not happen, but she starts talking about them like it's going to happen, which starts really driving a lot of people crazy. But she is more concerned about how she looks in society rather than presenting herself as who she really is. And then she starts to hold a lot of grudges because things don't go her way. And in turn, she is very unforgiving towards her daughters for them not doing what she wants them to do or what she believes they should be doing. She also is very prideful in the fact that she just wants everyone to know how miserable she is, how sorrowful she is, how anxious she is, how her nerves are shot. She talks about it constantly as, oh, woe is me. It's seriously woe is me all the time with Mrs. Bennet. And as we know, gossip is just a way to make us feel better about ourselves and make the other person look bad. Whether we're telling the truth about that person or not and we're gossiping, it is a sense of authority. We feel power in talking about other people. So the pride comes in the form of gossiping. There is a lot of gossiping going on within this book. A lot of gossip here and there and everywhere. Gossip is really the name of the game in this book. And everyone needs to know about everything else in everyone else's life and what's going on. And they compare themselves with the stories that they're hearing, which then pursues prejudice. And then we come to my final thought about the pride. It's about who you know. And that becomes prideful and prejudice. Mr. Collins thinks he's better than everyone else just because of his association with Lady Catherine. He really has no right to feel prideful because he's really nobody in the eyes of anyone. But it's all about who you know. And because he knows Lady Catherine, his worth starts to build up as he starts to introduce himself to other characters in the book. So I hope I haven't given too much away on Pride and Prejudice. I hope I haven't made any spoilers so bad that you think, well, now I know the story. I hope I haven't done that to you because that wasn't my wish. What I really wanted to do was just give you an introduction to the characters in a fun way and hope that you are interested enough to pick up the book and start reading it yourself. Now my next video is going to be about these characters again and some of the wonderful quotes that I have taken out of the book. We're going to be exploring some of their behaviors and their attitudes in their own voices. We're going to get to know them a little bit better by the things that they say and their behaviors. So I hope that you will be looking forward to part 4 of Pride and Prejudice. It's time to get involved and subscribe. Get the notifications. Feel free to share and comment below. But let's keep it nice because I don't like bullies. Get real. Subscribe.